What if the most dangerous moment in a war isn't when the bombs start falling, but when a temporary pause comes to an end? History suggests that ceasefires rarely resolve the underlying issues that caused a conflict. More often, they provide time for governments to reassess their options, reposition military assets, replenish supplies, and prepare for what comes next. Whether diplomacy succeeds or military operations resume depends on what each side believes it can still gain. Recent public reporting has fueled renewed discussion about the possibility of additional U.S. military operations targeting Iran. At the time of writing, many operational details remain disputed or unconfirmed, and official statements continue to evolve, rather than treating every report as established fact. It is more useful to examine the strategic logic behind the decisions each side could make if tensions continue to escalate, because modern conflicts are rarely determined by a single airstrike. They are determined by incentives, by geography, by industrial capacity, by logistics, and by each government's willingness to absorb economic and military costs over time. Today, we're going to examine those incentives. We'll look at why a temporary pause in hostilities may fail to produce lasting political results, why military pressure often struggles to achieve strategic objectives, how Iran has spent decades adapting its defense posture to survive sustained air campaigns, and why the consequences of another major escalation could extend far beyond the Middle East. To understand today's situation, we first need to understand why temporary ceasefires often break down. In military history, pauses in combat are not always signs of peace. Sometimes they are opportunities. Sometimes they are necessities. Sometimes they simply reflect the reality that both sides need time to regroup. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, governments have repeatedly agreed to temporary pauses while continuing to pursue the same long-term strategic objectives. Negotiations may continue behind closed doors, but military planners usually assume that hostilities could resume with little warning. That creates a difficult strategic dilemma. If one side believes negotiations are buying valuable time for its opponent, continuing the pause becomes increasingly difficult to justify. Game theory helps explain this dynamic. When two adversaries fundamentally disagree on the desired end state of a conflict, every ceasefire creates competing incentives. One side may view the pause as an opportunity for diplomacy. The other may see it as time to strengthen defenses, disperse equipment, repair damaged infrastructure, or relocate critical military assets. If both governments believe the other is using the ceasefire to improve its military position, mutual trust quickly disappears. From that point forward, even a relatively stable pause can become extremely fragile. This broader framework helps explain why discussions surrounding Iran remain so complex. For decades, the United States has sought to limit Iran's ability to expand its regional military influence and advance sensitive nuclear technologies. Iran, meanwhile, has consistently argued that its missile program and nuclear activities are necessary components of national defense and sovereign security. Those competing objectives leave very little room for compromise. Even during periods of reduced military activity, neither side is likely to abandon its long-term strategic goals. That is why analysts often argue that any pause should be viewed as temporary unless accompanied by meaningful political concessions. Open-source reporting has suggested that recent diplomatic efforts have produced only limited progress, although the full scope of those discussions remains unclear. If those assessments are accurate, military planners on both sides would almost certainly continue preparing for the possibility that negotiations could fail. This brings us to another critical factor that often receives less attention than missiles or fighter aircraft. Geography. Maps do not change. Political leaders do. Military technology evolves, but geography remains remarkably constant. Iran occupies one of the most strategically significant positions in the world. It sits between the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, the Caspian region, Central Asia, and the broader Middle East. Its coastline overlooks one of the world's most important maritime energy corridors. Its interior is dominated by mountain ranges that naturally complicate conventional military operations. Unlike flat desert battlefields, mountainous terrain offers concealment, defensive depth, and opportunities to disperse military infrastructure across vast areas. For decades, Iranian defense planners have designed their military strategy around these geographic advantages. Rather than concentrating critical assets in a handful of large bases, open-source intelligence indicates that Iran has increasingly emphasized dispersion, redundancy, and hardened facilities. The objective is straightforward: reduce the effectiveness of precision air campaigns, complicate enemy targeting, and ensure that military operations can continue even if individual facilities are destroyed. Whether every reported underground complex or dispersed command site exists exactly as described remains impossible to verify independently. However, the overall strategic approach aligns with decades of publicly documented Iranian military doctrine. That distinction matters, because modern warfare is no longer simply about destroying targets. It is about disrupting an opponent's ability to function over time, and that raises an important question. If a power alone struggles to achieve decisive political outcomes against a geographically resilient opponent, what options remain? To answer that, we first need to examine how Iran's military has evolved over the past decades and why its defensive strategy looks very different from the conventional armies many Western planners were built to defeat. To understand why military planners continue to debate the effectiveness of an extended air campaign against Iran, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine how Iran has prepared for this possibility over the past 2 decades. Unlike many conventional militaries, Iran is never expected to match the United States aircraft for aircraft or ship for ship. Its strategy has been built around a different assumption. If direct military superiority is impossible, then survival becomes the primary objective. That objective has shaped nearly every aspect of Iran's defense planning. Open-source intelligence and publicly available satellite imagery suggests that Iran has invested heavily in dispersing critical military infrastructure across multiple regions rather than concentrating it at a handful of major installations. The logic is relatively straightforward. A centralized military can often deliver greater efficiency during peacetime. But in wartime, centralization creates vulnerability. If command centers, or bases, or missile depots are concentrated in a few locations, a successful precision strike can disrupt an entire military network. Dispersed infrastructure changes that equation. Instead of relying on one command center, multiple regional headquarters can continue operating. Instead of storing missiles in a single depot, inventory can be divided among numerous hardened locations. Instead of depending on one production facility, manufacturing can be distributed across separate industrial sites. This concept is sometimes described as resilience through redundancy. The goal is not to prevent every strike. The goal is to ensure that no single strike becomes decisive. Missile forces provide another example of this philosophy. According to publicly available assessments, Iran possesses one of the largest ballistic missile inventories in the Middle East. The exact number varies widely depending on the source, and many estimates remain uncertain. What matters strategically is not the precise inventory. It is the diversity of the arsenal. Short-range systems, medium-range ballistic missiles, land-attack cruise missiles, long-range wind-sway attack drones. Each serves a different operational purpose. Some are designed to overwhelm air defenses through sheer volume. Others prioritize accuracy against fixed infrastructure. Still others emphasize long endurance, allowing operators to strike targets hundreds of miles away at relatively low cost. This layered approach complicates defensive planning. Every interceptor launched against an incoming missile carries a financial cost. Every radar system must remain operational around the clock. Every defended facility requires additional personnel, logistics, and maintenance. Modern air defense is extraordinarily capable, but it is also resource-intensive. Military planners therefore evaluate not only whether an attack can be intercepted, but whether repeated attacks can be sustained over weeks or months. That question becomes even more important when unmanned systems enter the battlefield. The widespread use of drones has fundamentally changed modern warfare. Conflicts in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Middle East have demonstrated that relatively inexpensive unmanned aircraft can force defenders to expend interceptors worth many times the value of the incoming threat. This does not mean drones replace traditional air power. Far from it. Instead, they complement missiles, electronic warfare, reconnaissance platforms, and conventional aircraft. Used together, they create what military analysts often describe as a saturation problem. Even highly capable air defense systems have practical limits. They can track only a finite number of targets, engage only a certain number simultaneously, and maintain interceptor inventories that must eventually be replenished. Iran appears to have incorporated these lessons into its evolving doctrine, rather than seeking complete air superiority. Its emphasis has increasingly shifted toward creating persistent operational dilemmas, force the defender to stay alert, increase the financial cost of interception, complicate targeting decisions, and gradually impose pressure across multiple domains instead of relying on a single decisive strike. Command and control represents another critical piece of the puzzle. Western militaries have traditionally emphasized centralized coordination supported by secure communications and integrated battlefield awareness. Iran has pursued a somewhat different model. Publicly available assessments indicate that authority has gradually been delegated to regional formations capable of continuing operations even if communications with higher headquarters are disrupted. The exact structure of these networks remains classified. However, the broader concept reflects a familiar military principle. If communications fail, operations should continue. This reduces the likelihood that a single successful strike against senior leadership could immediately paralyze the entire defense structure. Underground infrastructure is perhaps the most widely discussed element of Iran's military posture. Over the years, Iranian officials have released videos showing missile storage complexes, underground tunnels, and hardened facilities. Independent analysts have verified some locations through satellite imagery, while many others remain impossible to confirm publicly. Even so, the strategic objective is clear: harden critical assets, conceal movement, protect launch platforms, and complicate an adversary's targeting process. Whether every reported facility exists exactly as claimed is less important than the uncertainty itself. Military planners must assume that additional sites may exist beyond those already identified. That uncertainty affects operational planning from the very beginning of a campaign. Taken together, these capabilities illustrate a broader shift in military thinking. The central question is no longer whether one side possesses more advanced aircraft or more sophisticated precision weapons. The real question is whether those advantages can generate lasting strategic effects against an opponent specifically designed to absorb sustained pressure. And that leads directly to the next phase of our analysis. If both sides understand each other's strengths and vulnerabilities, how might an actual escalation unfold? Not as a single dramatic battle, but as a prolonged contest between military operations, economic endurance, and political decision-making. If military operations were to intensify again, the next phase would likely look very different from the opening days of a conventional air campaign. Modern wars between technologically advanced opponents are rarely decided by a single strike or dramatic breakthrough. Instead, they evolve into contests of endurance. The side that preserves combat capability, maintains logistics, and sustains political support usually gains the strategic advantage over time. That reality helps explain why analysts continue to debate what a prolonged Iran confrontation might actually look like. Contrary to popular perception, the objective of an air campaign is not simply to destroy targets. It is to shape an opponent's decision-making. Military planners generally seek to reduce an adversary's ability to coordinate operations, limit its freedom of action, and increase the political cost of continuing the conflict. Whether those objectives can be achieved depends largely on how quickly the targeted nation adapts. Iran has spent years preparing for the possibility of sustained long-range strikes. If those preparations function as intended, the country's response would likely emphasize survivability rather than immediate escalation. Rather than concentrating forces for a conventional battle, commanders could choose to disperse equipment, relocate mobile launchers, strengthen passive defenses, and preserve strategic assets for later phases of the conflict. Such measures are consistent with publicly discussed elements of Iranian military doctrine, although the effectiveness of any specific preparations would only become clear during actual combat. At the same time, Washington would face its own operational challenges. A sustained air campaign requires far more than combat aircraft. It depends on aerial refueling, intelligence collection, satellite communications, electronic warfare, precision-guided munitions, maintenance crews, regional air bases, and secure logistics stretching thousands of miles. Every sortie consumes resources. Every intercepted missile requires another interceptor. Every damaged aircraft must be repaired or replaced. As conflicts become longer, logistics increasingly determine operational tempo. History repeatedly demonstrates that industrial capacity and supply chains can become as important as battlefield tactics. This is where geography once again becomes a decisive factor. The Persian Gulf is one of the world's most heavily monitored maritime regions. It contains major naval installations, commercial shipping routes, offshore energy infrastructure, and numerous military bases belonging to multiple countries. Any increase in military activity would unfold within an environment already saturated with surveillance systems and overlapping security interests. That creates both opportunities and risks. Commercial shipping is particularly vulnerable during periods of heightened tension. Even without a formal blockade, insurance premiums can rise dramatically. Shipping companies may alter routes. Energy traders often react before physical disruptions occur. Financial markets tend to price in uncertainty long before infrastructure is actually damaged. For that reason, military planners pay close attention not only to kinetic operations, but also to perceptions of risk. A conflict does not need to halt maritime traffic entirely to generate significant economic consequences. Even limited disruptions can ripple through global supply chains. Much public discussion has focused on the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow maritime corridor remains one of the world's most strategically important energy choke points. Analysts have long debated how Iran might attempt to increase pressure in this area during a major confrontation. Possible options discussed in open source assessments include expanded naval patrols, the deployment of sea mines, the use of anti-mine ship missiles, unmanned surface vessels, or one-way attack drones. Whether any of these options would be employed would depend entirely on political decisions made during the conflict. Their effectiveness would also depend on the responses of regional and international naval forces. Closing or severely disrupting maritime traffic is considerably more difficult than it is often portrayed. It requires sustained military effort against opponents with extensive surveillance, mine-minus countermeasure capabilities, and significant naval resources. At the same time, keeping the waterway fully secure during an active conflict would also present substantial operational challenges. The result is less a binary question of whether the strait is open or closed and more a spectrum of increasing operational risk. Another factor frequently overlooked is the role of regional partners. Any prolonged conflict would almost certainly extend beyond two countries. The United States maintains extensive security relationships throughout the Gulf. Regional governments would face difficult decisions regarding airspace access, logistics support, intelligence cooperation, and forest protection. Each decision carries strategic consequences. Some governments would prioritize deterrence. Others might focus on preventing the conflict from expanding further. Balancing those objectives would become increasingly difficult as military operations continue. Meanwhile, Iran's network of regional partners and aligned armed groups would remain an important strategic variable. Open-source reporting has documented varying levels of cooperation between Tehran and armed organizations operating across several parts of the Middle East. The exact degree of operational coordination is often disputed. Nevertheless, analysts generally agree that these relationships provide Iran with additional options beyond conventional military operations. Rather than seeking direct military confrontation everywhere at once, Tehran could choose to apply pressure across multiple theaters simultaneously. The strategic objective would not necessarily be territorial gain. Instead, it would be to increase uncertainty, stretch defensive resources, and force opponents to divide their attention across several operational environments. This reflects a broader principle of asymmetric warfare. When facing a conventionally superior military, creating multiple simultaneous challenges can be more effective than concentrating resources on a single battlefield. For Washington, that means military planning extends well beyond Iran itself, protecting regional bases, securing maritime trade routes, supporting allies, maintaining freedom of navigation, and preventing unintended escalation would all compete for attention and resources at the same time. As the number of competing priorities increases, so does the complexity of decision-making, and that brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. If neither side is likely to achieve a quick or decisive military victory, what exactly would success look like? The answer isn't likely to be found solely on the battlefield. It lies at the intersection of military endurance, economic resilience, diplomatic leverage, and political will. Those broader strategic consequences may ultimately prove more significant than any individual strike carried out during the conflict. If there is one lesson repeated throughout modern military history, it was this: the consequences of a war are rarely confined to the battlefield where it begins. Military operations may occur within a specific region. Their economic, political, and strategic effects often spread much farther. That is why governments far beyond the Middle East are watching developments involving Iran so closely. Their greatest concern is not necessarily who wins the next exchange of strikes. It is whether the conflict remains limited or gradually expands into a broader regional crisis. Energy markets illustrate this point better than almost anything else. The Persian Gulf remains one of the world's most important energy-producing regions, even in an era of increasing renewable energy investment. Global oil and liquefied natural gas markets remain deeply interconnected. A relatively small disruption in one critical shipping corridor can influence prices thousands of miles away. Importantly, markets often react to expectations before physical shortages ever occur. Insurance costs can increase. Freight rates may rise. Shipping companies can delay departures or alter routes. Commodity traders begin pricing additional risk into futures markets. As a result, economic effects may emerge long before any measurable reduction in global supply. This relationship between perception and economics has become a defining feature of modern conflict. Financial markets process uncertainty almost as quickly as military intelligence systems process battlefield information. That broader uncertainty also affects strategic planning in Washington. Any sustained military campaign requires political support at home, stable defense production, reliable supply chains, and the ability to finance long-term operations. History suggests that military power and economic capacity are closely linked. Industrial output, energy security, defense manufacturing, transportation networks, and fiscal stability all influence how long a nation can sustain military commitments. Wars are not won solely by tactical success. They are sustained by national capacity. The same principle applies to every major participant in the international system. China, for example, is likely to evaluate developments primarily through the lens of long-term strategic competition rather than immediate battlefield outcomes. Beijing has consistently emphasized energy security, diversified trade routes, and resilient supply chains. Any prolonged instability in the Middle East could accelerate existing efforts to reduce strategic vulnerabilities while expanding diplomatic and economic influence elsewhere. Russia faces a different set of calculations. Its broader geopolitical interests include maintaining influence across Eurasia while preventing additional strategic pressure along its southern periphery. Although direct military involvement would represent a major escalation that few analysts currently expect, Moscow will continue assessing how regional developments affect its own security environment and international partnerships. Europe confronts yet another challenge. Many European governments have spent the past several years adapting to changing energy markets and restructuring portions of their supply chains. Another period of sustained instability affecting global shipping or energy prices would create additional economic pressure, particularly for industries that remain highly energy intensive. For policymakers, preventing further regional escalation is therefore not simply a diplomatic objective. It is also an economic necessity. Yet perhaps the most significant lesson extends beyond any individual country. The conflict highlights how the character of warfare continues to evolve. For much of the late 20th century, military superiority was often measured by the number of advanced aircraft, tanks, or warships a nation possessed. Those capabilities remain essential, but they are no longer sufficient by themselves. Today's military competition increasingly rewards resilience, distributed logistics, industrial adaptability, cyber capabilities, space-based intelligence, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, and the ability to integrate enormous volumes of information into rapid operational decisions. In many respects, the defining feature of 21st century warfare is not simply precision, it is persistence, the ability to continue operating despite sustained military, economic, and political pressure. That observation applies not only to Iran. It applies to every major military power preparing for future conflict. Perhaps the most important question, then, is not whether one side can launch a larger strike than the other. It is whether either side can achieve its political